morning. Welcome, everyone, to our Committee of the Whole. At this time, I would entertain a motion to approve the consent calendar.
To approve.
Thank you. All in favor, please address by raising your right hand. All opposed? The motion carries. At this time, I will turn the 2.2 to administration to Mr. Meek is chairing this area. Mr. Meek.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. First item on the agenda is 2.01 is appearance of visitors. We have 3 visitors. And does somebody want to read that?
Yes. Welcome to those who have signed up to speak today before the Board of Trustees, and thank you for your interest in Greenville County Schools. Before we begin, let me remind everyone of the following procedures. As each speaker's name is called, he or she should proceed to the podium at the end of the board dais, where there is a microphone and a light system. Each speaker has up to 3 minutes to speak to the board. The light system will be green for the first 2 minutes and will turn yellow when 1 minute remains on the speaker's allotted time. In keeping with board policy, KCA, abusive language or personnel attacks aimed at students or staff members will not be permitted. All speakers are expected to behave in an orderly and respectful manner. The board will not engage in discussion with the speaker or respond to comments. The superintendent will designate a member of the staff to respond to each speaker in an appropriate and timely manner. At this time, our first speaker is Matt Reeves. If you would be so kind as to step up there.
Good morning.
Good morning.
My friends and I are here to talk about a subject that you are all passionate about, and is educating our children. And so we'll be the easiest people that ever come before you. We just want to help a little bit, or try to help. Will was brought to my attention, and I've thought about this for a long time working with the Frazee Center. I've been working with kids in Greenville County for 14 years now, after school. I'm director of the Frazee Center and the director of Mentor Upstate, and so we're very connected to our school system. And with many of our children, they sometimes find themselves in out-of-school suspension. And I've just thought, well, that happens. You did this, and now we're suspending you from school. Until I've researched more and thought more about it, and then realized that the kids that I deal with, a lot of times out-of-school suspension is not a penalty for them, but it does affect them negatively. Maybe not in the negative way that we would want it to. Sometimes it seems very punitive and not restorative. And for many of my children, it puts a big strain on their moms who are working hard to make things happen, makes them get off work. But really it doesn't. They still have to go to work. They still have to take care of their other kids. And a lot of times we have 7 and 8 or 17 and 18-year-olds at home alone doing what they want to do. And so what we would like to do is maybe put together just a little group of educators, of some of the community, and see if we can come up with something that would work instead of out-of-school suspension. We're not here this morning to say that we have it figured out. We're just here to say that we have questions, and we think maybe you have questions too, and all of us have jobs, and all of us have responsibilities, and so we would say, would you allow us, and not that we get a response, but we get a response, would you allow us to put together something for you? If we could come up with something, look at best practices in other states, other counties, and say, how could we not suspend kids from school? How could we keep them in school when they have a suspendable offense that for right now? How could we keep them in school, restore them to what's going on at school? Again, we know that you have a ton to do. I have a ton to do too. But Will called and said, hey, what do you think about this? And I said, well, I've been thinking about this for 10 years. And he said, well, let's do something. And I said, okay, well, let's go ask. So we would just humbly ask you guys, who I know you care about our kids and you care about our schools, keeping them safe, would you allow us to put a little group together and see what we can figure out, come back and present it to you? And if it's crazy, just say it's crazy and we'll go on with it. But we'd like an opportunity to see if we can help fix a problem that we see. Thank you so much.
Mr. Reeves. Second speaker is Will Boughton. Boughton. Thank you.
Hi, excuse me, I'm Will Boughton. I'm a Greenville High School graduate, went to Greenville County Schools my whole life. My parents, my dad, Ralph, is here also. My parents met at Greenville High, so we're Greenville County School District through and through. I am now honored to be the D-team football coach at Greenville High. I'm a Furman University grad, played football here, and I have a nonprofit that basically tries to encourage former college athletes to coach and mentor kids in their sport. Use their sport that they were good at, that they got a college education through, in order to mentor kids coming up now. And Greenville High has been amazing for our nonprofit. They've allowed us to use their facilities in order to, I had 22 former college football players that are college graduates coaching our Greenville County School District kids, 4th through 8th grade. We had 150 kids, it's like 148 in the program this fall, which has been incredible. In only 4 years, we've grown it that way. Our program's grown so much to where we're the D-team football coach. And if you look at my 45 D-team football players, reminder, because I know all of y'all aren't as thick into D-team sports as I am. That's 7th and 8th graders zone Greenville High. Out of my 45, at least 20 are at-risk kids. Well, I have 4 children myself, an 8th grader at Hughes Academy, a 6th grader at Charlestown Center, a 1st grader at Augusta Circle Elementary, and then a 3rd grader who's not in school yet. What did I say? A 3rd grader, sorry, a 3-year-old. Thank you. That's why I brought my dad. You're not allowed to speak yet, remember. All right, so bottom line is my 8th grader, I get a call from Hughes Academy. Of course, everybody knows the 355 number, right, as a parent. And I see it and I say, oh, that's one of my schools. And so I said, hello, and it was Mr. Morgan at Hughes Academy. Hey, you need to come pick up William. He's suspended for 5 days. This is my 8th grader, and I'm like, what? And I said, I'm sorry, what happened? He said, well, he slapboxed yesterday after he was dismissed from school on school grounds. So I'd go, my wife and I stop what we're doing. We fly up there. Hey, can we meet with, the assistant principals, Miss Davis and Mr. Morgan? They could not have been nicer, could not have been more helpful. I'm not here to complain about staff. And I said, well, what, 5 days out of school suspension, I said, Mr. Morgan, can you look up in the computer? Has he ever been in trouble? I don't know, but has he ever had detention? Has he ever had a referral? In over 8 years in Greenville County School District, William had never had even a warning. Mr. Morgan was like, nope, we see nothing in here. So I said, so you're telling me first offense, 5 days out of school suspension? He's like, yes, sir, sorry, our hands are tied. They were very apologetic, but this is the policy, and we've been consistent with it. And I'm like, okay, and of course, I want my son to be punished. He deserves to be punished. Slapboxing leads to fights. He was doing it with a friend. I have it on video. I thankfully, one of his knucklehead teammates videoed the thing. And so I was able to see that, okay, this is what happened. It's clear as day. So that means I got a minute left, or am I out?
You got a minute.
Okay. So long story short, he's now, my son, my son's going to be fine. He's an AB honor roll student. He was in the Beta Club. He's now no longer in the Beta Club because he got out of school suspension. He couldn't try out for the basketball team because he got out of school suspension. He was done with the football program because he had out of school suspension. All these things, and I'm sitting here thinking, my son will be fine. I'm not worried about my son. What I'm worried about is my at-risk kids. What did they go home to when they're sent home for 5 straight days? The instruction that they lose. Because William went from an AB student.
You need to sum it up.
Wrap it up. Bottom line is, I call Matt Reeves, I call Public Education Partners, all my friends in the district. We all want to use out-of-school suspension as an absolute last resort. That's my bottom line. And we want to try to put together a task force of educators, administrators, nonprofits like Public Education Partners and Community and Schools to say, can we present to you guys a possible solution? That's it.
Thank you. Ralph Boughton.
Good morning, I'm Ralph Boughton. I got emotional when I think about Greenville's a great place to grow up. I'm fortunate to do that, but on the at-risk kids, a zero tolerance policy is just putting them on a path to prison. The positive influences in our lives are school, parents, family, church. And when we kick kids out of school, we remove them from a very positive influence and probably put them in a very weak, poor family situation. And you take an at-risk kid and you kick him off the football team, the basketball team, you've removed a male figure from that young boy's life that could be a positive influence. I'm not advocating corporal punishment at all. I played football for Slick Moore. He had a leather strap. He only had to do it one time. I ended up being president student body at Greenville High. If they'd have kicked me out of school, no telling what I would have done. But the zero tolerance for kids that make mistakes is just not right. There's no question we want to discipline children. The discipline program at Greenville County Schools needs to be very robust. And what Matt and Will are recommending is a very robust in-school suspension program that can be teaching opportunities for children to mature. And let's have male figures in the school. I know at Greenville High, J.F. Lucas was the assistant principal. I never had one problem with Will Boughton. I mean, J.F. took care of it. And so the in-school suspension offers the opportunity to rehabilitate the student. Punishment needs to be administered, and we need to take that as an opportunity, as a teaching moment, a learning moment for the student to help them mature that their behavior, their one mistake or their second mistake was not right. But sending them home is not the solution. The solution is an in-school suspension program. Have them line the football field. Have them clean the restrooms. Have them wash the dishes in the cafeteria. Put them to work. Keep them under supervision. Don't send them home unsupervised. And so I'm very supportive of Matt and Will to have a task force to come back and make recommendations to this board. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Next item on the agenda is item 2.02, Comprehensive Annual Financial Report. Dr. Royster.
Thank you, Mr. Meek. I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Stack for her to do her first annual comprehensive financial report. Ms. Stack?
Thank you, Dr. Royster. We have Larry Finney here today with us. He's with Green Finney, who are our external auditors, and he has a presentation of the year ended June 30, 2019 that he would like to go through with you all.
Thank you, Robin. Madam Chair, board members, appreciate the opportunity to be here. I also appreciate you guys putting the most exciting presentation first on the agenda.
You're welcome.
What I want to do is a couple different things. I briefly want to talk about the audit itself and the results of the audit, but we'll probably actually just spend a little more time talking about where the district is financially at June 30th and what the financial condition looks like. Obviously, we can take questions at the end, but if you have them along the way and want to ask, that's fine too. So what I like to do is when we talk about the financial statements, that is the responsibility of the district, and obviously there's a lot of information in there, a lot of financial information, a lot of disclosures. But what's behind the scenes, we don't always spend a lot of time talking about, but we actually think it's just as important as what's actually in the financial statements. And that's the internal controls and the processes and the procedures that really make sure that if they're operating well at the district, are making sure that all that information that's in the financial statements is accurate and complete and correct. So one of the things that we think is so important, and I will say we feel like the district really does a good job of this, and that is what we just call continual risk assessment, where we're constantly asking ourselves, is there something that we can do better, or is there an area that we're concerned about that maybe we need to change how we're doing things? Part of that risk assessment is thinking about the risk of errors, but it's also talking about the risk of fraud as well. And we've talked about in the past, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but when you look at this risk of fraud and the fraud triangle that we've looked at in the past, the reason I like to keep this up here is to remind y'all that you can't do anything if Larry Finney is in a position to where he's thinking about doing something he really shouldn't do from a fraud standpoint. You can't do anything about my need or my rationalization for how I'm getting there, but where the district can do something about it is that opportunity, because I can get to the point that I'm really thinking about doing something, but if the opportunity isn't there, then it's actually not going to happen. And that's where the importance of good internal controls comes into play. So, having said that, the district also is obviously, it's your financial statements. This is what you have Ms. Stack and the staff, the good staff that they have, to do all the work they do every day that in the end results in these financial statements that get presented to you. So what you then ask us to do is to perform our audit procedures. And got a couple reminders there just in terms of what an audit is and what it isn't. But when it's all said and done, what the end result of our work is that opinion that's toward the front of the financial statements. And I'm glad to tell you that for the year ended June 30th, 2019, the district has received an unmodified opinion, and that's as good as it gets. So again, you ought to be very pleased as a board and as administration with those good results. So having talked about that, let's talk about where you're actually at financially as of that last year end after the audit. And we always like to, just as a reminder, we always like to start with general fund balance, because if anybody's going to look at one measurement for how the district's doing financially, this is what they're going to look at. And so you can see that the district's general fund balance actually increased a little over $31 million for the year to $160 million in total. You've got some of that $160 million that is set aside for other purposes, such that the unassigned piece of general fund balance is about $154 million. That represents about 23% of what you have budgeted for this fiscal year that we're in right now. And as a reminder, I've got a couple of things up there. So number one, you've got a board policy that as a minimum, you want to make sure there's at least 1 month there, which is about $55 million. But there's also the national organization that's out there, the Government Finance Officers Association, or GFOA. And they continually update their recommendations. It's been a similar recommendation for the last several years now, but their recommendation is that you try to have a minimum of 2 months. And obviously at this point you're above that 2-month minimum as well. Just some reminders about why that fund balance is so important. And we've talked about several of those things before. Probably the one thing I want to mention that's a little bit different as we go forward is we're starting to hear rumblings about maybe the economy's not going to continue to be as robust as it has been the last several years. Obviously, nobody really knows, but a lot of us can probably remember back in the 08, 09, 2010 time frame when we were going through that recession and had to live through some mid-year state budget cuts and some other things. And so that healthy fund balance is real important if we ever end up in one of those kinds of situations again. So how'd we get there? How'd we get to that point with our fund balance? Our general fund revenues were about $623 million for the year. You can see that's about $40 million more than where they were in the prior year. We saw some really healthy increases from the state this year, both EIA, EFA, as well as some other areas in general fund. Property taxes were very healthy again this year with the continued growth in Greenville County. And we were actually about $25 million even over what we had budgeted for the year, most of that coming from the state level. Oops. General fund expenditures, about $615 million, and you can see it was about $29 million more than where we were in the prior year. Most of that was salaries and benefit increases, and you can see we were about $10 million under budget for the year. And again, most of where we were under budget was on the salary and benefit side of things. The next couple slides, in terms of talking about our other funds, are really just some reminders to you. When we talk about special revenue funds, obviously there's a lot of different state and federal programs involved in that, but all the money that the district receives for those programs from the state and federal governments are restricted in terms of how they can be used, and so there's some a lot of regulations and requirements that go along with that. I'm going to talk about that in a minute when we talk about the single audit, but this is just kind of some of the highlights for the special revenue funds. And then the other funds you have out there, your debt service fund, you've got about $25 million. Most of that is set aside for reserves based on the bond agreements you have. You've got about $134 million, and I know you in capital projects, and I know you've got plans for those funds. Your food service fund is sitting at about $22 million. It increased about $1 million for the year. Just a reminder that the state food service area wants to see the district's fund balance be under 30%, and if it's not, then the district, they ask the district to send in a plan for how you're going to get below that 30%, and so we've all talked about that, and the district's got some good plans for making sure that that happens in the future. Not going to spend a lot of time on these next two slides, but just as a reminder, we all know how underfunded the state retirement system is and the state health system. And several years ago, the district had to begin recording your piece of that underfunded liability that exists at the state level. On the retirement side of it, if you combine the regular state retirement and then the PRS retirement, the underfunded piece is about $25 billion. Big number. You can't do anything about that, right? That's the state's responsibility to handle that. But the district's piece of that is about $754 million. The good news is you don't have to come up with a way to pay that. As long as you keep making your retirement contributions like you always have, the employee and employer piece, you're doing everything that you can and should be doing. But as long as it continues to be as underfunded as it is, just know that the rates are going to continue to go up, and so it's going to continue to impact the district's budget in that way. And then we basically have the same story with the retiree health insurance. That number for the district's about $715 million, but exact same story. Long as you're paying the premiums and doing what you need to be doing, it's really up to the state to make sure that they deal with that underfunded issue. But this is an area where there have been some pretty healthy increases over the last few years, and that's probably going to continue to impact the district's budget as well. Just some highlights in terms of the capital asset activity and where the district's at. You've got about $1.2 billion in total capital assets. Obviously, most of that is in your buildings and related equipment. And just kind of some of the highlights in terms of what happened in terms of your commitments going forward. And then on the debt side, your outstanding debt is actually down to about $737 million, and it continues to go down as you make your required payments. And you can see on an annual basis right now, you're looking at around $73 million in terms of your long-term debt annual payments. I told you I'd come back to the state and federal funds. So as a reminder, because the district receives so much federal money every year, the federal government actually asks us to select a program every year to test and make sure the district is in compliance and doing the things they need to be doing. This year we looked at IDEA, and glad to tell you no compliance issues, no findings. The district's doing a very good job with the IDEA program. The other document that we provide to the board is what we call our management letter. It's got two things in it. One is just some required communication from us to you. The other piece is any recommendations that rise to the level that we feel like we need to put it in writing and make the board aware of it. The one we have in there is one that we've talked about annually for a little while now, and that is just a reminder that we talked about the importance of internal controls, and the one place where it's really challenging is at the school level, and that is simply because there aren't enough people there to really segregate the duties the way you want to help improve controls. And so because of that, just know that the risk is a little bit higher, that something could happen out there. Obviously, the district's not only does district administration monitor that well in terms of the activity, but your internal audit group also does. That's one area that they do a lot of monitoring as well and keep an eye on things. So that's really it for this year. Just in summary, number one, you got that good unmodified opinion. Congratulations. Everybody should be pleased with that. Your financial condition is good. Just know that especially with what's going on at the state level, that the district's budget is going to continue to be impacted in the retirement and the healthcare area. And I do want to just say that we really appreciate, I know that you have good district finance staff, but we get an opportunity once a year to come tell you that, and they've done a great job this year in helping us with the audit. 'Cause it's a big task for them. They're busy enough as it is day to day, and then all of a sudden they have all these folks that come in and hang out for, probably 6-7 weeks in total, and just bug them and ask them a lot of questions and ask for a lot of information, and they really do a good job. So with that, we'll be glad to answer any questions you have.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Royster, do you have any further comments yet?
Figure out how to work my microphone. No, sir, not any particular comments as to the specifics in the audit. Certainly appreciate their work on doing this, and finances work in putting together all the information. It's always reassuring to hear that we've received a good audit. Thank you.
Any questions from board members? Ms. Goodwin Caldwell.
I'm trying to pull it up, but it was on page 3 in the audit. What does the RSI, who provides an assurance on RSI, because it said that you couldn't provide that?
Yeah, the RSI information is information that is developed by the administration. So our regulations don't allow us to provide the same kind of opinion on it, but we still review it and make sure that it's consistent with all the other financial information. So we still do look at it.
And you said something, I know that the student activity funds is high risk. How often are the student activity funds audited? Is that audited every month? They choose certain schools to audit, right?
They do.
So do they get to all of the schools in one year, or is they, I know they taking a sample and everything, and you don't know whether it's problems unless you hear about it.
Yeah, they do an audit plan, and they try to do a 3-year rotation to get all the schools in within the 3 years. And it's based on that 3-year rotation, plus if there are any recommendations from the administration, principal changes, other things that affect which schools they audit in any one particular year.
Okay, how much has the special revenue funds decreased over the last 3 years? I saw where we had a big decrease. Has that been decreasing every year? With, especially, with Title I and all of that?
I'll have to
Is
get
it-
back to you on the exact numbers on that.
Okay.
I just know it did this year.
I believe Title I decreased in the
In
past
total.
2 years.
Yes,
Okay. That's all I have. Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Lewis?
Thanks. I really appreciate you coming every year, and I think this report is fantastic, and I agree. I think it does speak volumes to not just the finance department, but to this entire district and its ability to really keep a tight control over our expenses. And so I appreciate you, Dr. Royster, and the staff that really keep that as a focus. I had a couple of questions in the report, and we talk about them each year, but I just want to see if things have changed. So you mentioned retirement and PIBA as examples of some of the liabilities that show up on ours. Are there recommendations you would make of things this district should be doing to lessen that liability, or are you just making us aware because it just is there and...
Yeah, Mr. Lewis, it really is just an awareness issue. You as a district are doing everything that you possibly can to be done. And I've had some conversations in the past 2 or 3 years with the head of the retirement system, and they're constantly evaluating and figuring out what to do. But it really is a state issue, not a district issue.
From a policy question, though, if we go into the spring with the General Assembly looking at projected surpluses that they spend on programs and services that maybe don't exist yet, but there's this liability kind of sitting out there, would it reduce our liability if the General Assembly put more of its surplus into the retirement system?
It would, in the sense that if the state liability goes down, then your piece of that is going to go down as well. So yeah, it absolutely would.
And the state liability would go down by them taking, for example, funds that may be funds in excess of their budget and putting them into the retirement system.
Correct.
Can we talk a little bit about the fans statement that you made? So the state provides guidance that in general, your fans surplus should be less than 30% of your operating costs. Is that correct?
Correct.
And currently where our surplus is greater than 30%?
Correct.
And so is it your recommendation that we need to adjust that based on what the state's guidance is?
Well, yeah, and it's something that the district has addressed for the last several years. And what the state actually asks you to do is to simply provide a plan that says, okay, you're over 30%. What are you going to do to get to under 30%? Now, it used to be a more difficult issue when food service was what we called an enterprise fund, because you would spend money on capital, but it wouldn't go against your fund balance, only the depreciation would. But now that FAN is a special revenue fund, when you spend money on capital, it's a direct expense that will lower your fund balance. And so I think it's going to make it easier for the district going forward to be able to get below that 30% as you spend your funds.
And to follow up on that, we've started looking at what our long-term plan is to make sure we're below that. As you all know, we've always planned to and set aside funds in there to make sure that all that kitchen equipment that was procured during the BEST program, that we got funds sitting there when it goes. So that'll be part of the spend down. Likely the other thing that we'll do, will be to include in that plan perhaps the equipping of the kitchen at Fountain Inn High School. Because there are a lot of restrictions. I mean, basically that money has to be used in food service.
Right.
It's non-recurring, so we have to be careful with using it for salaries or fringe benefits. So that likely will be the kind of the safety valve for reducing that balance is when we get to the Fountain Inn construction to do the replacement or do the initial furnishing of the kitchen equipment through food service fund balance instead of having to rely on building fund or debt service fund.
Dr. Royster, is it enough to say these funds are in our fund balance because we need to replace these ovens later but not yet? Or do we have to actually spend the money and get it out? I mean, can we designate it for a future expense?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
We can
Okay.
designate it for a future expense.
So we don't have to replace ovens that don't need to be replaced?
No, sir.
We can
And
plan
we
to.
don't want to do that,
Okay.
but we may,
Right.
like I said, we may use as kind of, I don't know if the right term is to bleed it off a little bit, but to bleed it off a little bit, we may do the initial equipment at Fountain Inn through that.
Okay.
Which would then free up money that has less restriction on it by freeing up some portion of the building fund.
Okay. My colleague asked questions about the student activity funds. I just want to see if there's anything that you wanted to add to that. I mean, I know since you specifically named it as an area that we should be paying attention to, and knowing that, I know you've looked at what Mr. Barber and his team are already currently auditing. Are there recommendations that you have about better fiscal controls that the board should be looking at?
Well, I will tell you, I think the district made a really, really good step. I think it was just a couple of years ago, if I remember right, when your internal audit group actually put in place some monitoring of the financial activity at the schools. And I think that was a great step to take because that allows them to kind of be watching all of the schools at the same time, looking for anomalies and things that might kind of create red flags. So with that and with the monitoring that administration does, I really think you're doing about everything you can right now.
Okay. The last question I have about the report is starting on page 144. There's a section that talks about the reconciliation schedule, and it lists every school, and then it lists total expenditures. So when it says total expenditures, is that a summary of all the expenses that are assigned to that school, including it would include not just, it would include Title I dollars and
Total expenditures.
and student
Yes, sir.
activity funds. I mean, that's kind of the one place where there's a consistent number that this is what that school spent. Is that how am I reading?
Yes, it's
that how
all,
it's read
it's
correctly?
all of the funds. If you look at page 148, you will see that the balance of all the locations equals the amount of all the funds.
Okay.
So it is just a listing of the amounts that were spent at each location on our system.
Okay. So if we read it across and it says Augusta Circle Elementary, just because I spend more time there than anywhere else, and it says their total expenditures is $4.135 million. Is that just funds that are spent inside the school, or is there an allocation of Dr. Royster's salary that goes to?
It includes things
there-
like you said, it's
Yeah.
utilities, it's departmental money that was spent for Augusta Circle. It's everything that was charged to that location.
So there are allocations.
Okay. So if we wanted a per pupil expenditure per school, would this be the best place to get that number? Because I assume you could take that total expenditure and divide it by the number of students enrolled in the school and get an answer. I mean, is that if we wanted a number that said this is what we spend per student total, would you recommend that these numbers be the ones that we would? This is my last question.
The one thing
Oh, I didn't know it. Sorry. Sorry.
there are other expenditures that would be kind of like overhead
Okay.
that aren't in the individual location numbers. So
Okay.
it wouldn't be a total expenditure per pupil,
Okay.
if that answers your question.
Okay. But but just from a consistency's sake of kind of this school gets Title I dollars, this school gets an extra allocation for magnet funds, this chart calculates all of
Should
those
have
numbers
that.
and puts them in one place.
Yes,
There
sir.
may be other dollars that are also, from an overhead perspective, added to schools, but they'd be added to all of the schools. Is that? I'm just trying to find a place we can go to say, like, this is what we spend at Augusta Circle per kid, and this.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is probably a good starting point for that, because when you do the allocations, I mean, the district is doing it as best you can across the board.
Okay. The last question I just have, and I may go to Dr. Royster, I'm not sure. When this report is approved by the board, does this go to the legislative delegation, or do we keep that internally?
It's not specifically transmitted to them. I mean, it could be. It's not. It is posted online, and we're required to submit a copy to the state by a particular date. Do you remember?
December 1st.
By December the 1st.
Does the
And
state-
that's a requirement incumbent on every school district in the state.
And that's the State
provide a
Department of
copy.
Education
Okay.
that it goes to.
Okay. I may have the advocacy committee look at it. To me, it seems like, particularly with their interest in us having audits conducted on a regular basis and being sent to them directly, it seems like this audit is actually a better picture of our organization's financial health than the individual student activity fund audit that's being sent to them without any of this kind of really good, thorough context. So I may ask that the chairman of the advocacy committee consider putting that on a future agenda.
To your point, it is the most comprehensive report of the health of the district's finances in general.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Dr. Bell O'Connor.
Just a quick question in response to that. Do you think that people, when they see the amount of money that we have, fund balances, understand the requirement that you named in here? You know, when you're anticipating what the health might be, where we've been, what we need to do, or do you think that it likely has people looking and thinking, well, they've just got more money than they know what to do with?
Probably some of both. You probably have some people who think, wow. And then there's others who probably realize, especially if they're in this world or the business world. I try to, when people, sometimes people will ask me because we know we work with the district, and I try to take them back to their own personal savings and the fact that that's important for us to have personal savings. Well, it's the same thing with the district, because you never know what's going to happen down the road.
Gotcha, thank you.
And also to your point, Dr. O'Connor, it's our plan to bring forward to you sometime after you all have approved the CAFR this month, a proposal to allocate a fairly significant amount of fund balance to various projects, non-recurring expenses for the most part throughout the district.
Any other questions? Mr. Suddeth.
I'm interested in our third bullet point there. We say we expect the retirement and health insurance rates to continue to increase significantly. Why do we make that statement? What do we base that upon?
I'm sorry, what was that last word? Do we think what?
We have the expected retirement and health insurance rates to continue to increase significantly.
Right.
Why? What makes us enables us to make that statement?
Well, really, two things. One is earlier when I talked about how underfunded the state retirement system is and the state health plan, there's only a few different ways that they can try to improve that underfunding. And one of the primary ones is by increasing rates. So they've done it in the past. We know that they're going to continue to increase the employer retirement rates, and they may as well the others. On the health side of it, we just had, was it an 8.1% increase? The district just had an 8.1% increase in their health costs, as of this last July. And so historically, that's what they've done, and we would expect that to continue. So that's how it's going to continue to impact the district's budget.
So basically what we're saying is because it has increased in the past, then it's more likely it's going to continue to increase. And not just increase, but increase significantly.
Yeah, and because of all of these increases, there's still both of the plans are still significantly underfunded, even with all these past increases. So this is what we think they'll continue to do.
If we look at the health insurance rates that we have, those reinsurance rates are based upon what?
I'm not really sure how they determine what the rates and the increases are going to be, but I'm sure they're looking at their costs, looking at all the participants, and trying to figure out how to best balance that, I would think.
Is there a connection between our insurance rates and the rates that the federal government is looking at? You know, one of the things we're talking about is they're talking about health insurance or health insurance for everybody. And so I'm wondering, how significant is that as far as our school district is concerned? What they're saying and as to what we're saying, is there a connection there?
Yeah, I'm not sure about that.
I'm not either. Thank you, Mr. Meade.
Very welcome. Ms. Wales.
Thank you. I will have to admit I did not do as thorough a job as reviewing this before the meeting as I should have. So I apologize if some of my questions, if I dig a little more, I can find the answer to them. But just some little specific things. We show that we've got $4.6 million outstanding committed fund balance for special projects. That's from previous years. What do those include?
Excuse me, that was previous action by the board.
Right.
The major part of that fund balance is the personalized learning device program that you set aside funds for.
Okay. The IDEA audit that you did, is that embedded in here somewhere that I didn't see, or is it a standalone? Do you just?
Well, there's information about IDEA throughout the report.
Right. But you said you did a specific audit,
But
right?
specifically, let me find it. It's in the very back of the financial statements. There's a section. If you start on page 169, there's a whole section in the report regarding your federal awards. And so 169 and 170 kind of summarize all of the federal monies that you have. And on page 169, under U.S. Department of Education, you'll see there's a whole section on IDEA. So you received about $14 million, or spent about $14 million in IDEA. And then, Ms. Wells, if you'll go back to page 173, we have a couple opinions that we issue specifically related to this. Page 177, if we had any prior audit findings, we'd have to address those, but there were none. And then page 178 kind of summarizes all of our results from that single audit work.
Okay. Okay, great.
So hopefully that
So I'll
helps.
look at, yeah, that's great. Thank you. So we had our fund balance, the increase we ended up with, 30% of the increase came from expenditures under budget, which is about $40 million. Is that, you're looking
Can I
at?
take you to another page in the financial statements that'll help you see all the activity?
Yes.
If you will go to page 92.
Man, you're good. That's great. He's great.
There's several pages, but this schedule shows you all of the your final budget, what the actual results were, and what the difference is, both in revenues and then in your expenditures. And so this provides some details. So if you look at page 93, that summarizes that your revenues were 25 million over what you had budgeted. And then in total, if you'll go back to page 103, you'll see the same. The very top of page 103, you'll see in total your expenditures were 9.8 less than what you had budgeted. So those two together are what summarize get you to that almost 36 million in increase in fund balance. And so all that detail is there. You can see where that comes from if you want.
Okay, so is that mostly because we received more funding than we anticipated?
Yes.
From the state? Or
8.9 million of it was higher local, and most of that was higher property taxes, and your investment earnings were a lot higher than what you budgeted. We've seen that across the board with every school district. And then the rest of it was from the state. So your state revenues were about 16 million more than what you had budgeted.
Okay.
The single largest increase inside the state revenue, I believe, was that change in EFA related to special education.
Correct.
Which we could not forecast ahead of time. Now, we included it this year in the budget. We have to watch it very closely because it's in there on the proviso. The change was prior to this past year, you had to provide 250 minutes of instruction in special ed to make the student eligible for special ed weighting under EFA. They put a proviso in the legislature summer before last, which affected our revenue last year, and it's affecting it again this year, that removed that requirement, so it does not matter how many minutes you provide the service, you now can weight the student. And quite honestly, probably the majority of our services were less than 250 minutes a week.
Yes.
Students receiving services were receiving less than 250 minutes a week. That made up, I think it was about $6 million, Robin, something like. It was a pretty significant. 6.8 million dollars.
Okay.
And then we still, to our amazement, continue to track positive increases with vehicle taxes, which now is a little bit contrary to the national trend. It has begun to tail off. So those two things, which are, somewhat uncertain, although we did recognize the sped revenue in this year's budget, the year we're operating in now, because the proviso was in place before we completed the budget.
Okay, that's helpful. The percentage of fund balance we have, so we say every year, our board policy is 8.33, GFOA recommends 16.7.
Right.
We're now sitting at, what was the number?
23, I think.
23%. So two questions. How typical or atypical is it to be above that 16.7? How many districts do you think are meeting that requirement?
So we ourselves audit somewhere between 20 and 25 districts, and I would say probably 3/4 of our school district clients are over that minimum, maybe even more. But we have a few more rural districts that always struggle more, and so they tend to not be as high.
Okay. And so then I guess just from the administration's point of view, or maybe the board's point of view, I guess I'm wondering if that's the recommendation and we think it's best practice, why aren't we reflecting that in our board policy about the fund balance? Or why haven't we had that discussion?
And I'll address that first, because I do remember when that was all being discussed, and I know that at the time the discussion was very much a minute. What do we simply not want to go below for any reason whatsoever? So I think it was really looked at as a bare minimum what do we want to make sure we keep at least this much? And some of that, I know, was also taking into consideration kind of the recessions that you've gone through and knowing that there's going to be some ups and downs. So even in the most difficult times, what do we want to have as a bare minimum? And I think that's where that 1 month 8.33% came from.
But to add a little bit to that, I think, Larry, it goes back to, there were several years, maybe not one right after the other, but certainly one, then you'd go a year and it didn't happen, then you'd go another year, where we got cuts in the middle of the year. That started back in the mid-90s and continued up through the early 2000s. And then we had reductions because of the depth of the recession. So I believe that the original setting of that number came about after having had a series of state level reductions during, and when I say the middle of the year, in December, in January, in March, they say, we're not going to get any more money. And so in practicality, the amount's always been higher for that reason, and it takes more than the 8 point, always get the number back.
8.33.
8.33, I always want to say 8.35. It takes more than 8.33 to maintain cash flow until about this time of the year, generally November into December.
Right.
It takes more than that. But it does give a little more flexibility to go in there and utilize those funds. And your policy is written in a way that allows us to go in there and utilize those funds down to a certain amount as long as we put it back within X number of days. And that actually allows us to go below the 8.33.
Correct.
So that's probably a little bit of the history behind it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess in my mind, maybe it's just something that as the board, we talk about at a later date. It seems like if we know that's the right best practice number, if you got to have more than that, then to the point of, people that look at what we have in our fund balance and why we have so much beyond what our board policy requires, it just seems to me like we need to make an adjustment to the board policy to reflect what we know is best management practice.
Yeah, and I will say, most of my school district clients have board policies for general fund balance, and most of them are higher than the 8.33%.
Okay.
I think that would be a good thing for us to look at.
Yeah, okay, great. And then I guess one other just clarification for me. So we have this fund balance, it's one time. We can take the general fund balance and apply it to debt service cost as a way to buffer any needed increase in our capital spending, correct?
I'd say it just a little bit differently, but I think it is what you're saying. We can use general fund money to purchase items that would ordinarily be purchased through the capital budget. Yes, that's not a problem. You can't move it the other way.
Right.
There would be certain items that might be eligible to move the other way, but we pretty much stripped all them out of the budget.
Right,
So,
that's right, for technology and Mars.
And so when we send you a request somewhere in the neighborhood of $20 to $23 million in the next several weeks, what you'll see in there would be some that would be, that you would look at and say, well, that's a capital item.
Okay. Well, and I think that's just smart, for our constituents and for the citizens that are paying the taxes. If we have a fund balance, to be able to say, okay, yeah, we had a fund balance, but we're applying it to capital needs that we have and the debt that we're going to incur and otherwise have to raise taxes on that side. So, okay, well, thank you again for a great comprehensive report. I'll spend another couple of weeks perusing it now that you've told me what pages to look at.
You know how to reach me if you have questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Meek.
Thank you. Anyone else? Any questions? Hearing none. Thank you, Mr. Finney. Thank you, Ms. Stack.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Did we?
2.03 is the hiring
Mr. Chairman.
report.
We did the motion.
We need to vote.
Motion to
Oh, is
approve.
there a
We gotta have
motion to
action.
do it? I didn't look. Yeah. Is there a motion?
Mr. Meek, I move to accept the fiscal year 2019 comprehensive annual financial report as presented.
Second.
Have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? Hearing none, all in favor?
Aye.
Raise your right hand. All opposed, raise your right hand. Motion passes.
Thank you.
Next item on the agenda is 2.03 hiring report. Dr. Royster.
Thank you, Mr. Meek.